Okay, so we're coming to the last part, the conclusion of our thing. So far, we are not yet at the Huron Nation. All we've seen are certain patterns emerging over time, which are moving us forward, which change the nature of the society that we're looking at, communities undergoing change over a long period of time. The question is, how do these changes, as they're gradually collecting together, ultimately end up coalescing into the emergence of a nation, of a group of people who are connected together by language, by custom, by shared history and tradition and ritual? And we can think of it, we can take some of these elements and we can start to put them together. So when we move into horticulture, now we have the capacity to support larger populations. In other words, settlements can go from being 50, 80, or 100 people into many hundreds of people, perhaps several thousand people. So we have the possibility for larger groupings. And indeed, that's one of the things that we find, as he says at page 153. Am I on page 153? Sorry. In the late Iroquois period, villages generally tended to grow larger and to be located in defensive positions remote from navigable waters. So these are actually reinforcing features. Growing your food allows you to live in larger settlements. The forms of ritualized violence to replace or to reflect the changing economic circumstances, which then promotes the need for defense, means it's worthwhile now to come together in larger groupings. So you have these sort of reinforcing elements that promote larger village size. If you can imagine as a kind of process, and I'm going to summarize here what he says on pages 154 and 155, that what we can see is that the previous fragmentation of all these different groups living in and across the boreal forest along the lakes and rivers of this area, that the general pattern, the general tendency is one towards agglomeration or consolidation. So a small village here and a small village here, which previously may have had only certain kinds of stylized contact in certain parts of the year, now have not only the potential, but also the motivation to come together and sort of combine into one larger grouping. So that two previously isolated or somewhat semi-isolated communities can now form into one to create one single larger community. And as this happens, as more of these small isolated villages start to come together to form larger communities, this is what Trigger identifies as a tribal clustering effect. He says at the top of page 154, or his bottom of 153, top of 154, he says an example of how settlements originally consisting of individual clans, meaning just large families, extended families, could be drawn together into larger village units, and from there into what he calls tribal clusters. The drawing together of communities to form tribes led to the abandonment of many formerly settled areas and produced larger but more widely separated clusters of habitation. So to visualize that, if I have a community here, 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 and here, and now they all come together, I've created one larger community, but I've also increased the distance to the next settlement. So I have larger communities that are more isolated from each other, right? That also, if you think about it, will create a self-reinforcing effect. More people coming together is going to reinforce the social elements that make that community what it is, right? More communal storytelling, more evolution of language, more intense forms of ritual practice, etc. And it will also serve then to further isolate that community from its neighbor, which is now further away. So fewer contacts between these larger groupings. One of the things we find is, as he says, as this happens, membership in a clan, meaning your identification of who you are through your family, now starts to change and people start to identify themselves through their tribe. And clan forms now start to extend outward. And so one of the things specific to the Huron, for example, is we see that different people start to adhere to groupings that extend across clans, those groupings typically named after animals. And this allows identities to exist outside of small family networks, so that when you travel to to another community with same people of your tribe, you can find people who, like you, are turtles or beavers or bears. That creates a kind of identity. And you know this phenomenon well, because when you travel abroad and you meet somebody who comes from your own country, you're immediately drawn to them for no other reason than they speak your language. So that idea of a tribal community beyond a family community is one that still exercises a very powerful a very powerful draw on us today. As he says in a phrase that I particularly like on page 154, by the way, do not write like this in your essays, I will punish you. You have to be a trigger to get away with this. The resulting interdigitation of loyalties to clan and tribe and to clan and village constituted the warp and woof, which helped to hold expanding Iroquoian societies together. What does that mean? Interdigitation is this, putting your fingers together. So imagine cloth being woven. The idea is, as things are expanding out, as these settlements are getting larger, so the cohesion is enabled by these expanding identities. The fact that I can now identify with people who, even though they're not related to me, are part of the Turtle clan or tribe or part of the bear or whatever it is. This enables these identities to take hold and to be meaningful. Let me turn then, finally, to the bit that we started in, which is the role of markets in helping shape this shaping this environment. So many of the pieces of the puzzle for a nation are already in place. We have a group of people who can live in larger settlements, dependent upon each other for the production of the resources they need to stay alive. We've seen that we have the development of loyalties that now extend beyond merely families into larger groupings at the village and even the tribal level. So we have the capacity for larger identity formation. As groups get larger, we can see that the rituals that connect those groups start to implicate more people, so that we see the development of a kind of homogeneous culture. What then is the missing part? And the missing part I'm going to suggest to you is stability. All the things I've said could define anybody in terms of what makes them French or Spanish or Filipino or whatever, Japanese, whatever it might be. But the other part is that you have to stay in one place. It's difficult to hold on to your nationality, your nationhood, your sense of who you are, if you're migrating around all the time. You need to be in one area. This is where I live, is a key part of being a nation, of identifying yourself in this way. And this is the decisive role, or it's here where I feel that markets play a decisive role, albeit an exogenously decisive role. Let's remind ourselves where it was that the Huron ended living. If you drove to Toronto or flew into Toronto, rented a car and drove due north, you would be driving through Huronia, through the territory in which they lived, that area around Georgian Bay to the north of Lake Ontario. In fact, let me come back to my map. Okay, back to North America, big picture. He has a very detailed argument for this. It starts from page 157 going forward. You'll find the critical parts of his discussion starting at page 165 through to 175. So I'm going to provide an aggressive summary, and I'll let you work out some of the particulars for yourselves, because of course this is the heart of the essay question that I've asked around this topic. But let me give you a few pointers so that if you decide to write on this topic, you'll know where to turn and how to interpret what he's saying. We saw already, starting with the Hopewell culture in the so-called Middle Woodland period, that already there were forms of exchange that were taking place across these tribal boundaries, that people were moving goods from one area into another. The scale of trade was small, the nature of the good was exotic or rare, but nonetheless it establishes the principle of exchange, right, amongst groups. Starting then in this later period, the Huron, as they sort of gradually separate themselves from other Iroquoian bands, remember here are the Iroquoian bands, and they're sort of all mixed in here. The Huron end up in this spot right here, north of Lake Ontario. And this is where they stay then for many hundreds of years. And it's that stability, not only of culture, but of place, that I think is determinative in establishing the so-called nationality, nationhood, confederacy, whatever the term is that you want. So the question is, why were they able to stay here? What was going on here that provided them with this kind of the stability that allowed them to settle there? And the answer, very simply, at least as Trigger suggests, and I have to say myself, I find it a very compelling proposal. He puts it very well on page 165. He says, one of the chief attractions of the historic Huron country seems to have been its location, which had great potential for trade and commerce. And we can see why this is when we look at this map, because here to the south, we have agricultural areas which are much more predisposed to crop production than the relatively cold and short growing season of the Great Lakes region up here. To the north, we have the Algonquin, who spoke a different language from Iroquois. The Algonquin, today, people, for example, like the Northern Cree. And unlike the Huron, unlike the Iroquois, the Algonquin had never adopted agriculture because the terrain, the environment is unsuitable for it. They were not, as it were, seasonally or cyclically pre-adapted in the way the Hurons were. So to the north of the Huron, we have a population that remains relatively, or in fact, quite sparse, that is still practicing a hunting-gathering lifestyle. The basis of their economy is the hunting of animals like beaver and caribou. Whereas to the south, we have people who are practicing the cultivars such as corn, and importantly, tobacco. And so the Huron settling here, right, essentially situated themselves between two separate economies. They situated themselves between a hunter-gathering economy, which, when it generated surplus, was generating surpluses of goods like animal skins, very useful keeping yourself warm in winter, and an economy to their southwest, which was generating surplus goods like, for instance, tobacco and corn. And so the Huron, by existing, and you can't really see it at scale here, if I pull up maybe this map, it's a bit clearer, you can see the lakes that are going through. This area that stretches along a diagonal line from, say, Indiana and Illinois through Detroit, Toronto, up into northern Ontario and Quebec, represents a kind of axis of trade. This is the easiest point through which to move goods from the north, south, and goods from the south, north. And so they essentially occupied a territory that gave them a kind of monopolist position as brokers of this trade. The trade that was facilitated, skins and other items from the north moving south, tobacco and corn from the south moving north, passed through the hands of the Huron. And as many of you know, it is a good business model when you can be the broker of an exchange. Because every time an exchange takes place as a broker, what do you get? You get a little piece of the pie, right? So if you can keep yourself in this position, not only does it position you enviably as the facilitators of this trade, but it has wealth generation effects as well. And I think that's what we're seeing here in the case of the Huron. As a matter of what we might call fortuitous and accidental historical forces, the Huron gradually, as a result of this entire picture that we've drawn for you today, gradually migrated out of this sort of larger environment of fragmented individual settlements into more and more cohesive groups, shifted into horticultural production, and then ended up in this little corner where by fortuitous circumstances, they ended up monopolizing the trade that extended north-south between these different regions. It's not necessarily that the trade was particularly abundant, but the important thing is that these two economies, the northern economy and the southern economy, were complementary to each other, such that you end up with a form of integration that northern people need things from the south, and southern dwelling people need things from the north. And here are the Huron now, essentially not only to facilitate, but to benefit from that trade. As wealth increases, of course, then the very forms that exist inside a society tend to intensify, such as, for example, the ritual practices, the class distinctions, etc., that you would find. But it was an ideal place to be located in order to develop a nation, because it gave you this ability to be permanent. And that's why we find that over several hundred years, the various groups, these are slightly different language groups that are all mutually intelligible and have slight distinctions, we might call them tribes, the various tribes that make up the Huron remained essentially in the same place over many hundreds of years because they could benefit from this trade. And so all of these put together then allows the development of a nation to emerge. So to conclude my remarks today, when we look at the birth of the Huron, we're looking at many historical forces which are implicated by this class. So the transition from hunter-gathering into agriculture being the most important, presumably. But we're also then looking at the importance of markets. It's a silent role. It's not a role that we would normally point to, but it might be suggested that were it not for a kind of exogenous market logic, the Huron Confederacy, the Huron nation might never have existed, because its whole survival, its existence, was predicated on the facilitation of this trade. And where we have trade, we have a market. So to finish with perhaps a somewhat glib phrase, you might think of the Huron as the market makers of the 17th century, but from making that market, they were actually then able to adduce an entirely distinct cultural and, one might say, national identity.